Ladies and gentlemen, I think why don't we get started? Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I'm fortunate enough to direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. It's our distinct pleasure to be hosting the final meeting in a series that we entitled New Horizons at the Nexus of Environment, Population, and Conflict. We're focusing today on sustaining natural resources and environmental integrity during response to crisis and conflict, something that unfortunately we see in many chronic situations, but increasingly today above the fold headlines, so to speak, critical considerations and crises, frankly, in some really tragic situations around the world. But what we've got today is two leading experts and practitioners in trying to do this. And so I'm looking forward, and I know you are as well, to hearing the real practicalities of how this works, how this doesn't work, the challenges and the hurdles of bringing environment, natural resource management into a systematic approach in crisis and conflict and post-conflict settings. And so we're really thrilled to have both Anita and Charles here to walk us through that and have a rich discussion. A few housekeeping matters before. One is that we are broadcasting this event live on the web, and then the video will be archived. So what it means is when it comes to discussion, if you can wait for one of my colleagues to come to you with a microphone so the folks online can hear that. We have Classroom and Columbia University and a group of students at Monterey Institute, among others, watching today. So we want to make sure they can share in the conversation. The other is just a word about the Wilson Center and the Environmental Change and Security Program. Seeing a few new faces, I'll just mention that you're sitting at the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson. As our only president who had a PhD, Congress in 1968 saw fit to create a living memorial where the worlds of scholarship and research could come together with the worlds of policy and practice on a range of different topics so that those respective enterprises could learn from one another and improve each other's endeavors. The Environmental Change and Security Program we're in our 14th year, and we are trying to, in fact, bring these three broad areas together: environment conservation, health, including population issues, development, and then conflict and security policy. And we've been doing that in meetings like this, in publications that are in hard copy out front, but increasingly online with our website, with our blog, with our podcast, with our videos and such. And so we hope that you will visit us online as well and share the insights from today's meeting going forward with colleagues. I should also like to mention that as is the case in a number of the programs that we, the Environmental Change and Security Program, do here at the Center, we're generously supported with both intellectual and financial support from USAID, and it's often the Office of Population and Reproductive Health. What's been unique and quite constructive about this endeavor is it's also included support from the Conflict Management and Mitigation Office at USAID, as well as the biodiversity folks in EGAT. And for those of you who even for those of you who do spend a lot of time working with AID, you will know that it is unusual, highly unusual, if not unprecedented, for this gamut of offices to work together and collaborate. And so we're thrilled that we're able to do that here at the Center, and that folks from those different offices are able to join us today. So enough of me talking. I'm going to turn the floor over first to Anita van Breda, who is the Director of World Wildlife's Humanitarian Partnerships Program based here in D.C. And Anita is going to give us kind of a foundation and then also talk about some specific cases. Anita and WWF have been very active in working with humanitarian organizations, obviously as a conservation organization, in a number of these settings around the world. So we're looking forward to her sharing her insights. She was very helpful in formulating how we approach this topic, because there are obviously lots of different ways to do it. Unfortunately, we couldn't take them all on, but I think we're doing that. We found a good approach, and Anita's been very helpful in doing that. Charles Kelly is going to follow with a number of also case discussion, somebody who has a lot of field-based experience, decades of field-based experience working in a variety of different settings, currently affiliated with the Benfield Hazard Research Center, University College London, Charles is somebody who can really tell us how this does and doesn't work in the field, and we're thrilled that he's been able to join us. I should mention, I was remiss in not saying this right up front, that because one of the reasons that it's been so difficult to tackle this topic is that the speakers that you'd like to have are in the habit of getting pulled into crises. Surprise, surprise. And so that is the case today, that we were hoping Marion Pratt from USAID could be joining us today, but alas, the situation in eastern DRC, Congo, means that she is working on very important things, and so we're happy that she's doing that, and we'll be able to call on her for her insights on these issues as well in the future, but unfortunately Marion couldn't join us. So Anita, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, and I'm very grateful to be able to share this experience with you and appreciate the interest that the Woodrow Wilson Center and your donors and supporters have shown in this topic. I'd also like to say that it's a real honor to share the stage with Charles Kelly, who's one of the earliest and most diligent experts in this area, and we've learned a lot from him, and so it's delightful to be here together with you. I'd like to start by just giving a very brief overview of World Wildlife Fund for those of you who are not familiar. We're a global environment conservation organization working in 90 countries around the world. We're a membership-based organization. We have close to 5 million supporters around the globe and approximately 4,000 staff. I joined World Wildlife Fund in 2002, working first on our marine conservation program, primarily in Asia, and then in 2005, shifted to the Humanitarian Partnerships Program, which I'll talk a little bit about more later. So just briefly, what I'd like to discuss with you is the background to this issue of environments and disasters, and what does that mean. And for the purpose of this discussion, I'm using the word disasters to cover both natural, man-made, conflict, and complex emergencies. All different, but there's also a lot of similarities. I'd like to discuss some common issues that we've observed over the years, examples of practices, both good and bad, and then reflect a little bit with you on the future, and then finally conclude with a few recommendations. I'm not going to read this all for you, but I'd like to start with some of the sobering statistics. For those of us working in this field, we've recognized that unfortunately disasters are a growth industry. It's astronomical, the number of disasters, and they are increasing both in number, severity, and scope, and we can expect with climate change to see an increase in weather-related disasters. One factoid that I would like to share, though, because I find it very interesting, is the World Bank did an evaluation of their disaster projects in 2006, and they concluded that the most frequent negative outcome of the World Bank disaster projects is a subsequent disaster, lessening the impact of their response, and they observed this in approximately 30% of their projects. And I am quite certain that much of that has to do with environmental issues. And considering that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, that's quite significant. But we also know that a healthy environment can enhance the capacity of societies to reduce the impact of natural and human-induced disasters, and the UN has been very clear about this. But where are healthy environments and healthy communities? Unfortunately, many communities impacted by disasters suffered from unsustainable baseline conditions before the event took place due to many factors: deforestation, overexploitation of natural resources, poor development practices, and of course poverty and conflict is often a cause and or an effect of these issues. So in our view, in disaster response, the goal should not be to go back to those marginalized pre-existing conditions, but to try to do better. So how is the environment related to risk and vulnerability? Well, there are some common issues that we have observed. One, spatial planning is a key issue. This is a photograph of a housing reconstruction in Banda Aceh, Indonesia. You can see maybe in the background there's a seawall that was built to protect this community from the sea. But unfortunately, this was built in a floodplain. So this housing and these communities are subject to flooding. And unfortunately, this is a sad example of a waste of donor resources and building materials because this is uninhabitable. Another common example is unsustainable resource extraction for building materials. If all the timber that was required to construct more than 150,000 homes in Banda Aceh after the tsunami came from the local forests, there wouldn't be very many local forests left. And those forests provide other ecosystem services in addition to serving as a source of building materials. But it's not just timber, there's other materials as well. And the photo on the left shows a hillside in Banda Aceh, Indonesia, that was basically removed for building materials. What you can't see in the photograph at the bottom of that hill is a community who now is subject to future risks from flooding and mudslides. Unsustainable livelihoods. Livelihoods get reconstructed after disasters. And this is an example from the Maldives, where the big new boat in the back is replacing the smaller, modest boat in the front that was damaged. A focus on infrastructure and providing materials and supplies makes sense. But if we do that absent of building back the human resource capacity to manage natural resources, what we're doing is setting up these communities for future food insecurity as they exploit a declining resource base, and in this case, it's fisheries, related to fisheries. We've also seen a lot of examples of human-wildlife conflict. This is a photo from Sri Lanka, where a community was moved to an area that prior was uninhabited. The agency that did this building, however, didn't realize that this was an elephant migratory route. And you can see this garbage dump isn't very well set up or managed, so it attracts the elephants. And now this community needs assistance in managing conflict with elephants. But there are better practices, and there are a long list of better practices and a lot of reference materials describing better practices that have happened over the years. And I'm not going to describe them all, but a few that I found interesting was in 1998, USAID and AFDA was involved with emergency shelter rebuilding after a hurricane. They used salvaged timber, and they were able to reduce their costs by 30% and build 4 times the housing that they had budgeted for. There's other examples from Bangladesh, where in 2001 the government worked with UNEP to rebuild coastal green belts, protecting local communities from future cyclones, tidal surges. And in the case of the Indian Ocean tsunami, we saw a lot of examples of individuals and agencies trying to do things differently. The British Red Cross imported sustainable timber, for example, outside of Indonesia to rebuild their shelter. CARE seconded a staff member from IUCN, an environmental organization, to build in-house capacity for natural resource management. And there are other examples to point to. So if there are better practices out there, why don't we see more of it and see it more consistently? Some have suggested that what we need are more environmental guidelines or another checklist to help humanitarian workers. But in our program, we've reviewed over 20 different guidelines that address environmental issues in disaster response. And these are just a few of the ones that we looked at. And so we came to the conclusion that developing more guidelines or another checklist probably isn't going to have the significant long-term impact that we're hoping for. So at WWF, we did something different. In 2005, we launched the Humanitarian Partnerships Program by partnering with the American Red Cross to provide them with environmental guidance on their tsunami recovery program. We work with them on 4 sectors: livelihoods, water and sanitation, shelter, and disaster preparedness. And we were working together with them for 5 years in Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. And what we hope to do through this partnership is reduce risk and vulnerability for the environment and for communities, improve ecosystem services and community security, increase our own organizational capacity to work successfully with humanitarian organizations, and test what we hope could be a model for the future for other organizations. The way that we do our work is we work with teams on the ground. We look at all of American Red Cross's projects that they implement or that they fund others to implement, and we provide advice on how the environmental impacts could be minimized in those projects. We then go down to the ground and we work together with those agencies to look at how they can practically implement the advice that we give them. We do a lot of training through this partnership of American Red Cross, local Red Cross chapters, communities, and local governments. We've also practiced co-location of staff. So we have put World Wildlife Fund individuals in American Red Cross offices. They become part of the team. And what that does is it helps us learn each other's organizational culture, language, and view of the world. And it's made a tremendous difference in building trust between our two organizations. And so some early results of this partnership are, for example, in Indonesia, we're working on livelihood projects and helping American Red Cross and their partners adopt better management practices for shrimp aquaculture. We've been able to improve the outcome of the shrimp and the product, and therefore the financial return to local communities. For fisheries, we moved away from a focus on providing boats and nets and gear and focus on building back the human resource capacity of fisher associations, local governments, and civil society organizations to understand how to manage the natural resource base for the long term. In water and sanitation projects, we've worked with American Red Cross, who are great at engineering, but we help them look upstream and downstream and work together with us to adopt a watershed management approach. So because we want the source of the water to last as long as the engineering will. And then we've also looked at alternative technologies. The photo on the bottom right is a treatment wetland where in place of engineering for wastewater disposal, we've looked at different alternatives that have a more minimal impact on the environment. And so what we're doing with this 5-year partnership is testing the hypothesis that by working together, we can advance our agenda and support outcomes for both conservation and for beneficiaries of disaster response. So, for example, in shelter projects, by working together, we protect forests and we protect habitat, which is good for the environment and is good for biodiversity. And then the human communities benefit by having cleaner water, which reduces their exposure to disease, for example. Since the Indian Ocean tsunami, we've been able to practice this on several other disasters. One most recently was through a connection that Kelly made for us with CARE in Mozambique. We were able to go there and work with CARE to do an assessment after a hurricane and consider how the shelter reconstruction could take on environmental issues. We were quite shocked when we got there and learned that the local mangrove market sold in 2 weeks after the hurricane the amount of mangroves they usually sell in a year. So that's a huge pressure on a resource that's also required for those communities for their livelihoods. And then another example is we started working recently in China with our colleagues there on the earthquake reconstruction, again, trying to incorporate environmental issues into the disaster assessment and then also the recovery and reconstruction plans. In World Wildlife Fund, we took some time to look at our priority places and look at disaster trends over the last 100 years. So we looked at 6 natural disasters and what it means for where WWF works around the world. And we just recently issued that in this report called Global Disaster Outlook. And it paints a pretty grim picture. But we also, in the last few months, looked at conflict, and we are in the process of putting conflict issues on top of that disaster analysis to have a more holistic projection, and we are looking forward to launching that report in the next few months. But what this means for WWF as a global institution is that the environment and humanitarian issues are integrated, and we need to learn to work together, and we need to learn how to work together more successfully. This is a quote that I actually borrowed from this recent World Watch report, Beyond Disasters, which I found really very interesting and very helpful, but it does illustrate that the environment can actually help to promote cooperation. So what does the future look like? In World Wildlife Fund, we are examining our own experience and looking at other experiences around the world, and we feel that there is an opportunity for enhanced collaboration. And so we're in the process of launching this initiative that we call Breaking the Disaster Cycle. And we would love to work with folks in this room as well at examining how we can tackle this issue together for long-term solutions. We feel that this is a multi-sector approach. It includes governments, non-government organizations, and the private sector as well. All has a role to play. And then I'd like to conclude with a few recommendations. Number one, start at the beginning. To the extent that after an emergency relief stage is over, and that stage of disaster response always focuses on saving human lives, providing food, water, and shelter. But shortly thereafter, assessments take place, and the planning for recovery and reconstruction projects starts. And that's the best time to examine environmental issues and how the environment can help improve the outcomes of those efforts. I think environmental organizations can help by preparing, wherever they work, in advance, maps of key animal and plant distributions, key protected areas, and put that into a format that humanitarian agencies can use. We had to learn the hard way in WWF that our normal way of doing work, producing reports that are 30, 50, 100 pages long, is not going to work for a humanitarian worker, and certainly not in an emergency response situation. Second, I think we all need to stop the focus on the rush to respond. Again, after the emergency relief phase is over, when we're talking about developing reconstruction plans that are 1 year, 3 year, 5 years long, that's not an emergency response anymore. That's a development project. And so there is time to do advanced planning and to do advanced procurement of sustainable materials. Third, we think it's key to build integrated working relationships before an event happens. That sounds like common sense, and it's really hard to do. But for environmentalists and humanitarian workers to get to know each other and develop trust, we're going to have a lot better opportunity to be successful together after an event. And then lastly, fostering innovation and learning. In our program, we've used a lot of interns, and that's been both productive, but it's also been a source of inspiration for us to be able to work with young people, young professionals who are just going out into the world and giving them tools and training to think about how to do things differently. And in terms of advocacy, I would stress that in our view and in our experience, we need both a bottom-up and a trickle-down approach. We need to develop practices and techniques that work for that humanitarian worker on the ground who just has to get a water project in and develop solutions that are practical and doable. But we also need to work with their bosses back in their headquarters to make sure that environmental issues get mainstreamed into standard operating procedures, into policies of organizations. And then most importantly, donors have a real role to play. I don't think a lot of changes are going to happen in the future unless donors require it and help support it. So that's all. Thank you very much. And please visit our website if you would like more information or to see some of our documents, and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much. Okay, yeah, sure.
I can see what I'm saying. Good, okay. Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for being here for me to come and speak about this. I must say that most times when I come to speak about environmental issues in my community, which is disaster management community, if I have 5 or 10 people, we're really lucky. One time I did a whole presentation to one person, and he was already converted. I mean, so in most cases, I think that's one of our highlight a bit is the challenge of dealing with environmental issues or natural resource management issues in disaster context or a post-conflict work, which I'm going to speak a little bit about. By the way, a little bit, you have my biography, but a little bit of background. I've been working in disaster management, not in environment, for a couple of decades. And so my perspective is operational from a disaster management perspective. And it's something that I understand quite well, having done it a lot. And I'll tell you that the attitude we have is in disaster management is how many lives is it going to save and how much time is it going to take? If it takes a lot of time, I don't want to do it. If it's going to save a lot of lives, I think it's a good idea. So that's a perspective that you deal with when you come in and talk about environment. And Anita's comments were very clear on this, is that you give a 30-page report and it's not going to be read, and there's going to be no action. So the challenge really in dealing with disaster response and environment, or conflict, post-conflict and environment, is to figure out how to get the message to the right people in a way that will allow them to react to that. And so far we haven't, in many places, been successful in doing that. So a couple of the challenges. Of course, we all know a lot of conflicts have environmental links. We hope in some places that post-conflict environmental focused assistance does not lead to further conflict, but there are cases where it actually will. So the idea of coming in after a conflict and then helping people on planting trees, for instance, could actually create more more conflict problems and more environmental problems. Well, why? Well, that's one of the key issues. Because a lot of times, as Anita just mentioned, people come in a big rush to do things. And they don't think that if you're in an African community and you go and plant trees someplace, the person who plants the tree owns the land. Okay, so you've already created a basis for conflict. And if you think that's kind of esoteric, it actually has resulted in lives lost in Chad, where an NGO went in with the Sudanese refugees and said, well, it's a bad place here. It's very hot and dry. Let's plant some trees. Gave them trees to plant. They planted the trees. The neighboring community came in and said, you can't do that. It's not your land, et cetera, and there were actually some lives lost because of that. So very simple ideas of, well, we're going to come in and help the environment, particularly in a post-conflict situation, can create more conflict. Sometimes, and in most cases, I think, a lot of the post-conflict places that we have, DRC is a good example, the conflict's not really over. We've just moved to another stage of dealing with the conflict. And so in a lot of cases, you go into a place where you say, well, okay, we'll do these things. And you go, well, I'm sorry, we have a security restriction. Well, I thought the war was over. Well, yeah, but, officially it is. But you can't go here, you can't go there, you can't do this, you can't do that. You have these limitations. And by the way, don't talk to these two groups of people because they're not happy with each other. Okay. Or, by the way, they think so-and-so won and they're not happy. And the war may come up again. And DRC, by the way, is a good example of all these things happening at the same time in one country. But it's a big country. I think it's a challenge to say that, although I see there's handouts at the table out in front, that natural resource management interventions can actually reduce conflict in a post-conflict situation. What we assume is there's a link between the conflict and some kind of intervention that we can do to deal with the environment, like planting trees, for instance. There may be other issues. And Darfur is a good case where there are a lot of other issues, and natural resource management interventions may actually not really have an impact because we're not dealing with those other issues. Now, I make a distinction here between natural resource management and the big environment. So the big environment may have the things that we need to worry about, not necessarily those interventions that we tend to refer to as natural resource management. So in preparing for this, I thought, well, geez, what post-conflict situations do we have? And what opportunities are we looking at here, folks? And so in this list here, I think, if I remember right, the italicized ones are where I think the conflict's over, or at least it's not an active conflict. And the ones that are not italicized are where there's an ongoing conflict. And I obviously have not included everything, and I may have made a mistake because I note that Rwanda, I say, is not, the conflict's over, but I think in a couple of weeks we may see the conflict starting again because they may invade DRC. And there have obviously been tensions between Rwanda and the DRC and Uganda. So if you go through this list, you're looking at a lot of places that have had different kinds of conflict. And I include places like Northern Ireland, because what we always assume is that conflict is a developing country problem. Well, it's a developed country problem as well. And sometimes the problems that you see in developed countries with conflict can cause environmental problems and can lead to environmental damage. And so if afterwards somebody wants to say, I forgot a country, or you want to debate these points, I'm quite open to doing that. But I just want to look at what our opportunities were. Then I wanted to talk about a couple examples. And of course, we can debate what is post-conflict. Okay, so we have Haiti, where I was just a couple weeks ago. I'm sorry, the screen's crooked there. And it is not really post-conflict, but kind of it is. There's a UN military presence, 9,000 troops there, and a lot of police, that seem to be keeping things calm. But the question is, if they leave, will conflict start again or not? The fact they stay there is probably indication that somebody thinks that will happen. So it's kind of a half and half situation. But it's also had 3 hurricanes and 1 tropical storm in the last in a 2-month period, and so there's a lot of talk about environmental issues. There's a lot of talk about what to do next. Well, there's substantial environmental issues, and we're always concerned. You can see the river flooding there, and there's population living in floodplains and on the coastal area there, and this is just outside of Port-au-Prince. It's actually quite green down there right now, which is ironical. It's because it rained a lot, but it also caused a lot of flooding. So you have these positive, negative things about some of the environmental aspects there. We have a general understanding, and in Haiti there is a general understanding of the causes of the environmental problems they face. As a matter of fact, in the post-hurricane reconstruction program, the government put environment as one of the 3 focus areas. Okay, top focus area. We want to focus on the environment. So it's not a case of going in and saying, oh, you should worry about the environment. Most places in the world will say, yes, we need to worry about the environment. But in Haiti, it appears that we need a political change to deal with those issues. One of the fundamentals we know about environmental problems in Haiti, and part of the reason why the UN is there in force, is land tenure, land ownership, access to land. And it's been a long-standing issue. Goes back several hundred years, unfortunately. But basically, the people with power take land. And so there's no reason for somebody without power to fix the land. So why plant a tree when I know somebody can come and take the land from me or take the tree from me? Very simple equation. But to make those changes, to address the environmental issues, it's not the military presence that's going to make a difference. It's not declaring that it's post-conflict, but it's these fundamental changes to the political and economic structure in the country. And in the case of Haiti right now, it's unclear if the fractured government that exists right there can make those changes. So we're looking at a prospect of, over time, the military going away because it costs a lot of money. But the root causes for the conflicts in the country, that certainly the environmental linkages of those causes, will still continue. Okay. So this is one of my points I wanted to make, was that we're talking about an issue about the capacity of government to address problems in a post-conflict situation. Turning to Liberia. I want to take a little different perspective here. The United Nations Post-Conflict Unit, United Nations Environment Program Post-Conflict Unit, did an assessment after Charles Taylor left, and they came up with 60 recommendations of things that needed to be done on the environment, long-term, medium-term, short-term, all across the board. Well, I'll tell you right now, if I'm an emergency manager, 60 is a number that's 59 too big. Okay. And so one thing we got to remember is when you come in with the recommendations, like give them 5 recommendations. Don't give them 60. I mean, you can have 60, but say these are the 5 you need to worry about. So this is, again, a challenge in the post-conflict, post-disaster situation, is that if you come in with too much, they won't focus on it. So tell people 1 thing, 2 things, 3 things, 5 things. That's quite important. And I don't want to, the UNEP report is excellent. It's an extraordinarily good report. You should look it up on the website. It is full of so much detail, but the question is, can it be used? And UNEP tried to do that, and they came up with an environmental considerations of human displacement in Liberia document. Itself, very nice, very good. Best state-of-the-art knowledge about dealing with human displacement. Excellent report. Unfortunately, you can see from the picture in the background that it really didn't get followed 100% of the time. Because when they moved the IDPs out of the camps, they just moved them out of the camps. And then they ended up with camp situations which were full of garbage, latrines that had been filled in, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this lesson has been taken to be used now in Uganda, where they're trying to do, some of my colleagues are actually working on, David Stone, some of you may know him, has been working on trying to figure out how to clean up camps and close out camps. This is a big issue. By the way, it's not a sexy issue. As a matter of fact, it's a very stinky issue. And as a result, people don't want to do it. So you'll end up with environmental problems because everybody leaves the camp with all the garbage there. And by the way, they don't leave anything here that's valuable. So what you have left is just garbage. Okay. UNEP was able to get funding to develop an environmental protection authority, I think it is in Liberia, if the name's correct. And they did do a lot of work on things like the restriction on logging, the embargo on logging in Liberia, and change the laws and set in place a whole structure of dealing with logging in the country, which was a major concern because logging was being used to finance conflict. However, in that process, they may have actually missed a little bit of the the total value of forest resources concept, where you say it's not just the trees, but it's everything you can get out of the forest, the bushmeat, the medicinal plants, and everything like that. And so the process they went through there seemed to have been fairly successful in terms of dealing with the timber and embargo issue and getting more towards sustainable timber extraction. But they don't necessarily, it's not necessarily dealing with the fundamental resource issues about how to use forests in a tropical environment. And as I said, the effort did seem to address this export ban issue and got rid of the export ban, allowed timber to be exported, and that's good for the country. It helps it develop, but there are a lot of other issues that need to be dealt with. And one of the fundamental questions come out of the Liberian experience is how much change can you affect by putting in a focused environmental effort. There, they had the legislation, technical assistance, refurbished the office, trained people in GIS, produced beautiful reports. But how far can that go? I mean, what can you really get done in a post-conflict situation? One thing I did want to point out, and I know this is a little grainy, but this is some of the work that was done by UNEP. Excellent, very detailed work, GIS mapping of impacts of population displacement and things like that, scaling it and everything like that. So there's a lot of good information, but the question becomes who and how can that be used in actual implementation of things? And I suspect, but I haven't verified it personally, but I suspect that a lot of this will actually be shown to be just useful information. Go to Sudan. Dust storms in Sudan, by the way, are normal. It just looks good as a picture. In Sudan, there's actually the post-conflict unit also did a post-conflict assessment in Sudan, environmental assessment in Sudan. And of course, everybody jokes about it, saying, but post which conflict? Because they still have ongoing conflicts there. Multiple conflicts, multiple environmental issues. It's a very big country, of course. A lot of issues there. One thing that unfortunately has happened there is that, particularly in southern Sudan, in the Jonglei Canal, there was efforts done during the war, a latter part of the war in the south, to build roads and improve access. And unfortunately, this has worsened environmental conditions in the southern area. In the Jonglei Canal area, because it's actually created a barrier that's preventing water from naturally flowing across the area, and it's creating a barrier that's preventing wildlife from moving back and forth. And this was done in an emergency funding context. And then once the emergency was over, the people who funded it initially are trying to figure out what to do about that problem, because they can't really go ahead and take out the road, but they've created an environmental problem. So this is one of the issues that comes up in conflict, post-conflict, is sometimes during the conflict, the emergency assistance will create environmental issues, and then afterwards you have to try to figure out how to resolve them, and sometimes it's quite difficult to do that. Going back to Liberia, during the different conflicts in Liberia, there was a big effort to use swampland for rice production, and it actually runs into a conflict with U.S. environmental regulations, which says you can't start transforming tropical forests areas. And so during the conflict, they could use swampland rice production, but when they started to try to do it in a development context, they came into policy issues, and you're not supposed to do that. So some of these things, you can get away with something in a conflict, you can't in a developmental context. Darfur, we're all, I'm sure, familiar with a lot of the issues about Darfur. One of the major questions that comes up is are the resource issues the major driver in the conflict or not? And people sit on both sides of this. I know a Sudanese researcher who claims that it's not really resource issues, it's political issues. The resource issues have been around for a long time, and they knew how to deal with them. And now it's all politics, and they can't deal with the resource issues because of all the politics. The other issue that comes up is that the short-term perspective in Darfur, particularly in terms of getting people out of the camps and back to their homes, which has been a government priority and has also been an international priority if there's peace, has not allowed people to sit down and start thinking about how we're going to deal with environmental issues now and also in the future. It's been a very slow process, and I can go into more detail on that later. There has been progress, but it's been very slow. The irony, of course, is that in eastern Sudan, there are Eritrean and Ethiopian refugees who have been there for 20, 25 maybe 30 years. And there are all sorts of programs about how to deal with environmental issues and firewood issues and fuel issues and water issues in eastern Sudan. And none of that got translated over to western Sudan when the Darfur situation started. And I don't think a lot of that learning has happened anyway. In addition, western Sudan used to have a lot of refugees from Chad where they were doing the same programs they were doing in eastern Sudan. But they all left, and so those lessons never got learned, or relearned. And so there's a lot of problem that we have with things happening and people not learning or not understanding and then making the same mistakes over and over again. One of the things that's happening in Sudan, and both in the south, and particularly in the south because of the years of war, is a strong pressure to develop, build roads, open up areas, put in wells. Wells are a source of conflict. It's my water. Your animals can't come here. In some cases, it's between men and women. I'm a man, I want to water my animals. I'm a woman, I want water, and they get in fights. So there are a lot of issues about putting in wells, but there's been a big push now during the conflict and after the conflict to open up roads and put in wells. And nobody's really sat down and said, or very few people have sat down and said, wait a minute, are we going to have more problems because of this? So this is one of the tensions you have post-conflict is you got to do things really fast. And Anita mentioned this. You got to do things really fast after a disaster. Well, maybe not. Maybe you want to sit down and think about it a little bit. So a couple of lessons, or more than a couple, actually. Governance is key. If you don't have a competent government after the war, you're not going to solve the problems that weren't solved before the war because of incompetent governance. So there has to be rule of law. There has to be some procedures. Now, I'm not saying what style of government, but there has to be something where you start out by saying, okay, this is your piece of land. This is the rule of forestry. This is how you cut down trees. That all has to be putting into place after the conflict. Otherwise, you're going to have anarchy, and none of these efforts in natural resource management or environmental protection are going to work. Okay, post-conflict is a political process. After the war, it's political. It's not about humanitarian aid. It's not about environment. It's political. So political decisions will be made, and they may or may not take into account environmental issues. And again, the messages you have to deliver on environmental issues is it better be short and sweet. Otherwise, the politicians and the political decision makers are not going to do that. There's also a lot of money associated with post-conflict, which is quite important. Post-conflict assistance, although it may involve a lot of money, is very short-term. It's intentionally not done in a developmental context because they want to implement it in a matter of a year or 2 years or 3 years. And therefore, it doesn't have all these environmental constraints and controls, environmental review constraints and controls that normally exist. Anita was also speaking about this in general. It's something we found in many situations where people just want to come in and get out. We get the troops out, get our money out, and turn it over back to a normal. But nobody really has that idea what that normal is, and consideration of the environment really doesn't come in. And then echoing something that Anita pointed out, we have lots of procedures. I have a CD of 35 different documents that can be applied to post-disaster shelter reconstruction. We have little practice. It tends to be people who are invited in by chance, or a very active NGO, or an individual is very interested, like in Haiti, where the government says we want to have environmental issues addressed after the hurricane. But it doesn't happen very often. And most importantly is we usually don't have a stick. If you think about environmental review processes in the United States or other places, there's always some sort of thing that if you don't do it right, we're going to charge you money, or you can't do your project or something like that. In the post-conflict situation, you can't come and say, hey, wait a minute, you're going to cut down too many trees by doing this. You can't do post-disaster reconstruction. No, we're going to go ahead and do it. Somebody else can deal with that problem. So there have been some experiences where the stick has been brought out. And one case I'd like to cite is in Iraq with the United Nations Environment Program, and the Iraqi Ministry of the Environment found that the UN was going to dredge some areas around Basra where ships had sunk and everything like that. And so they found out about this, and they said, oh, wait a minute, what are you going to do with those ships? What are you going to do with what was on the ships, et cetera, et cetera? And the initial response was apparently something along the lines of, well, we're just going to get rid of it. And then over time, and particularly because of, I think, a more active Ministry of Environment in Iraq, they were able to say, wait a minute, we need an environmental action plan for this. We need a recovery plan. We need to consider all these things. And so that is a case where it has worked, but that's more of the exception than the rule. Thank you very much.
Well, terrific, Anita. Terrific, Kelly. We really appreciate these complementary presentations that really, I think, fit very well together and give us a lot to discuss. As I mentioned before, we are broadcasting this, so I ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to bring you a microphone. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from, and pose a question rather than a longer presentation, because we do have a lot of people, and I'm sure a lot of questions, including some from online as well. So who would like to kick us off in terms of the discussion? Okay. Will, if you could bring it down here in the front. We have a couple in front.
Thank you. My name is Heather Jeffen. I'm a small private sector. My question is to Mr. Kelly, Dr. Kelly. How much of all those conflict is influenced by external forces or external inducement, such as other country?
So can you talk about role of outside actors in what may be framed as domestic but never really domestic settings?
Well, it's, unfortunately, there are a lot of examples, if I can get back to the examples here. I think in many cases, in some of the conflicts we're seeing in places like Liberia, certainly there are external companies that are involved in harvesting and selling the timber. There's one of the big issues about the embargo, was it was being broken by companies. Apparently, at least one company from Europe that was buying timber when there should have been the embargo. So there's always an external factor. Diamonds in Sierra Leone, blood diamonds. You've all seen that movie. We also want to have a movie called Blood Trees because it was as big a problem, but it's kind of hard to carry around in your pocket. So the external factor is always there. I think the question is whether there are external parties trying to actually provoke conflict to get access to resources. I think that's much more harder to talk about, and that would have to be on a case-by-case basis. I couldn't really speak to that right now. Thank you.
One of the questions, excuse me, that we got from online, Anita, you alluded to this early on about climate change, and are you seeing the groups that you're working with anticipating and trying to plan for, particularly, this is Adrian Stork from Monterey Institute, is interested in, especially in terms of food security, what the implications are in the humanitarian crisis that you're dealing with. Are people going beyond thinking that this is going to become a bigger problem and really try to understand and plan for it?
Yeah, I think there are. There are some examples. A lot of the humanitarian NGOs that we work with either have climate change scientists on their staff or they have a climate change program. They're very aware of the fact that this is an issue that has to be dealt with and that is going to have significant implications for their work. I don't know that anyone, has the answer. I've seen agencies try to update and modernize their disaster risk reduction or disaster preparedness or disaster management type of programs to be able to incorporate climate change into it. So there are some examples. The International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies in Europe has a climate change center, and they provide both technical and financial resources to local Red Cross chapters to be able to start to improve their programs and their practices to address climate change. So yes, it is happening.
Yeah, looking at some of these funds, such as we'll see if the financial crisis allows for it, but say the IMF World Bank funds for climate that include some adaptation, be interesting whether any of that discussion comes together, or at least is put on a frame of fragility and conflict in terms of trying to make those investments one that will help strengthen those governance and capacity key variables that you're identifying as to which way it goes, and marrying those two discourses, or whether they stay separate as they traditionally have. Obviously, sitting in a program called the Environmental Change and Security Program, we're interested in whether these folks get together. Other questions, comments? Yes, another one down here.
Thank you. My name is Julia Clonis. I'm an economist working on development, consultant, and I focus on environment and gender. So my question has to do for both speakers. In your research, did you have a chance to look into the differential impacts by conflicts based on gender, given the socioeconomic and cultural differences in various conflict areas? Were you able to assess any difference in the impacts and also take into account such differences in your recommendations? Thank you.
Kelly? Well, if I understand the question, you're asking, have we looked at the financial implications?
Yeah.
The different financial...
Not necessarily financial, different impacts between men and women in the conflict areas.
Yes. And most humanitarian agencies that we work with have pretty explicit gender policies and procedures. And it's interesting for me as an environmentalist to see how gender has become mainstreamed in humanitarian agencies in their response to disasters, whereas the environment has yet to become mainstreamed in that way. And obviously there are a lot of natural resource management implications for the way that resources are used by both men and women and the power relationships between those groups. It's not something that in my program we have addressed explicitly. We are focused more on the environmental issues, the natural resource management issues, and making those known to the humanitarian agencies that we work with, and then they in turn put on top of that their expertise and their practices around gender.
Yeah, one thing I like to say, in just a general sense, I guess two things. One is that we've recognized in places like Sudan and Liberia, Sierra Leone, in many conflict situations in DRC, is that the impact of the conflict and on men and women is different. The second issue is that where people gather resources in the environment, or what resources they use from the environment, is also very, very important. And the classic example of this right now is in Darfur, where because it had been dangerous, deadly for men to go out from the camps to collect wood, women were doing that. And so it was a direct link between what women could get away with because of their gender and also the collection of natural resources. And so there's become more and more attention to those kinds of details, although in many cases the gender analysis is a secondary thought rather than the first thought. It sort of comes up second in the process.
Yes, sir.
You both were quiet on the engagement of companies, both small and large, in these kind of conflict to development transitions. Do you have any examples of companies either working along with you or else fighting, perhaps reducing the impact of the environmental considerations?
And if you could let us know who you are, sir.
Stephen Dahl, I just returned from Oxford.
After the Indian Ocean tsunami, WWF worked with Conservation International and a couple of other institutions on a project called Timber for Aceh. And in that project, we were looking at what would be the alternatives for timber in the building process in Aceh, Indonesia. And through that process, developed relationships with lumber supply companies who WWF has worked with before. And it's a very challenging situation because for me and for my program, we saw how difficult it is to match expectations, and the whole procurement process in an aid agency is widely complicated. So it became pretty clear that being able to match the need with the supply is not easy, and it's hard to do in an emergency response situation. So again, we saw that as an opportunity where if we could look at that issue in advance of a disaster, we could maybe try to facilitate some different approaches. But there are examples, and the one that I mentioned in my presentation, where British Red Cross, kind of on their own, went out and found a different supply of timber outside of Indonesia and brought it in. Some other agencies attempted that and weren't very successful, and there were issues about how do you define sustainable timber? What kind of definition do you use for that? Is there enough supply, and would it always be there where it's needed? So it is pretty complicated. But we would like to work more with the private sector, with corporations that either have some expertise or some skill sets to offer to tackling this issue, or who are directly involved in trying to solve it. And if you have suggestions or recommendations, I'd love to hear it.
Most in the immediate post-disaster, post-conflict situation, most companies are looking to sell services. And so if you can define a service that an environmentally focused company can provide, then they're willing to make money doing that. But in many cases, those opportunities just aren't coming forward. The mechanism humanitarian post-conflict tends to go towards nonprofit organizations or government institutions or subcontracts. But there have been some cases where either private sector companies or associations have come in. In Sri Lanka, after the tsunami, the German Waste Management Association came in and was looking at helping out on waste management after the tsunami. Unfortunately, their whole thing about how you handle, their perspective, how you handle waste in Germany was quite different than the way you do it in Sri Lanka. And they couldn't figure out how you can make a profit out of it in Sri Lanka. And so there was a difference in culture, and that's quite important. But on a positive side, there was a company that was brought in, I think, by the Danes to Kosovo. It was a private company, had a contract to actually train and set up a company to manage waste from buildings that were destroyed during the war, and also dealing with the munitions issue and the safeties issue, things like that. And so that was a project where they came in and showed them how to take down buildings and recycle the waste and everything. So that was a case where they could hire a company to come in and transfer skills, and something that would be useful in Kosovo in the future. So one issue is that if a company make a profit, they'll come in and help. But even when they come in, they may have a different understanding about what the problem is and the solutions are.
Hi, my name's Dane Bowker, and the DoD is often the first responder to overseas disasters and conflicts for the United States. And in your experience, how are they doing, and what changes can they make to make their responses and performance better?
Ellie?
Oh, okay. I'll take this one. Well, I would sort of contest your opening statement. I don't think, in many cases, they're leading, and there's a lot of tension about the role of the military in general in disaster response, which I won't go into. I can give some examples where the military has come in and provided the means that they have available to do something useful. And again, I go back to Sri Lanka and the waste cleanup in the southwest part of the country, where there's a Marine battalion that was assigned, a U.S. Marine battalion that was assigned to help. And they sort of came in and said, okay, what can we do? We got trucks, we got people, we got bulldozers. What do we do? And luckily, there was a combination of factors that came together that enabled the creation of a USAID-financed, NGO-run, government-supported cleanup program. Okay, and the military could come in and say, okay, we have trucks and bulldozers and things like we can do this. But they didn't have intrinsic knowledge about waste management. And so to give them the task of waste management would not have been very, very productive. Matter of fact, I met very briefly with the colonel in charge, and we were talking about this idea of working on the waste, and he goes, okay, fine idea, but I don't want to screw up. Okay, and he didn't. He was his team, his people were very useful in the process. So I think that's the key to it. The military can come in, but they don't have this experience in doing these kinds of strange things, like how to set up a labor-intensive public works project that cleans up buildings that have been destroyed by an earthquake. Okay, which was an issue in Pakistan, by the way, and was not successfully dealt with, I don't think. And so that's the gap. It's the resources are there, the command structure, the people who can do things if given a task. But the challenge is to define the task in a way that they can do that. And by the way, I'll just on this point, I'll just say that if you go into a donor and say we want $1 million to do waste management after a disaster, they'll laugh you out the door. If you come in and say, I want $1 million to do labor-intensive public works for livelihoods reestablishment to vulnerable populations, including at-risk groups with a gender perspective, it's like it's $2 million. Okay. So one of the things we've learned is that you don't come in and talk environment and waste and anything like that. You come in and talk livelihoods. You come in and talk these other ways. So the summary of my answer is the DoD does a good job, but the question is figuring out how they can take their skills and experience and move that into a totally different kind of environment.
Can I follow up on that? Do you see changes in that as there are new structures and new collaborations between state aid and DoD that is aimed at doing this? And of course, the headliner is what AFRICOM will or won't do. But there seem to be more attempts to try to make this coordination and finding the right balance of comparative advantages and who's in lead and who has resources and so. Is that kind of always been the same and we're static in the same place, or have you seen results from what seems to be greater attention put towards that?
Well, certainly in the United States and in the current evolution of DoD's policy in this area, has put a greater emphasis on involvement in non-kinetic operations, as I think they're calling it now, where the softer side is being shown. The difficulty is finding those opportunities. I mean, you can't do that. You can't send the U.S. military into DRC now, even though there's a great humanitarian need, because they get into the middle of a conflict. And in many opportunities for humanitarian interventions, that's part of the problem. Is that you get into the conflict, as the UN has found in DRC, is they're now part of the war. Okay, and we certainly want the U.S. military to go do a humanitarian thing, but also end up as part of the war. So there's that fundamental challenge to the whole policy approach. At the same time, there's this tension between the military and the humanitarian community. And some parts of the humanitarian community, like the ICRC, International Community Red Cross, will not deal with the military in a humanitarian operation. They'll deal with them in other circumstances, but not. And there's a range of NGOs, and the Americans have been actually quite criticized for this, because we have some NGOs that are considered to be part of military operations. They talk, walk, and act like the military, and many of them are former military, and others that want to stand, don't even want to get close to the military. It's an unfortunate situation in some ways, because the U.S. military, NATO, DPKO, the UN peacekeeping operations, have environmental procedures, regulations, and guidelines that are far better than the humanitarian community has. The military will not go in and start digging holes in the ground and building walls around their compounds without asking a question about who's going to fill in the hole and where the dirt come from. Okay, that's their procedures. They want to know those questions before they do it. Humanitarian community will come in and start hiring some guy with a cart to build a wall around their compound, not asking the question about where's the dirt going to come from, who's going to get pissed off, and who are we disadvantaging over this process. So on the one hand, there's this very strong, in some cases, very strong antagonism between the humanitarian community and the military. But the reality is that the humanitarian community can learn a lot from the military on how they do operations and how they minimize environmental impact, and the concepts that they have of, one person referred to it as, you'll never know we were there approach. They want to come in, set up their operation, do their stuff, and leave. And this is going over now into things like peacekeeping operations. The Swedes are very strong on this. Matter of fact, next week, week after next, they have a conference in Sweden to talk about how to address environmental issues in non-conflict situations. So peacekeeping in Sudan and other places like that. So there is a gray ground in this area, but the fact is that the military has procedures and processes that are better than the humanitarian community. And on the same time, the humanitarian community in many cases is so antagonistic towards the military, or fearful of the military because they think they're going to take their jobs, that there's really not good communication in this area.
Patrick.
My name is Patrick Hudak, and I'm with the State Department's Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science. And thank you very much for your presentations. I found them very enlightening. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think environmental degradation and competition for natural resources is affecting instability and conflict in Afghanistan? And what, if anything, you think can be done about that?
Another place that UNEP post-conflict disaster management folks have a report.
Yes.
I don't know anything about it.
You don't know anything about it? Yes. Oh, he's getting hot here. It's sort of an interesting question in the sense that there are a number of other problems in Afghanistan, the conflict, the opium production, for instance, the different ethnic groups and things, that it's kind of hard to pull out the environment from all these other issues. It's interesting. I heard a report that the people in Afghanistan were taking water out of a river, the Amudarya, that flows into the RLC and through Uzbekistan. It's a source of conflict in Central Asia between certain countries there. They were taking water out to irrigate, supposedly to grow poppies. Although somebody else who knows Afghanistan, so no, that's not the area they grow poppies in. So I think that's part of the issue, is that we don't really know how the resources are being used there in any extensive fashion. There are things like the mining, artisanal mining of Lopus lazuli or things like that. I mean, there's the snow leopard. I mean, there are a lot of things in Afghanistan that we just don't know about, and a lot of it's overlaid because it's a conflict situation, hard to get information out of the country. I know the UNEP has been working there for several years, since the fall of the Taliban, on building up a capacity, but I'm pretty sure that everybody's more focused on security than the environment in there. So that's the best I can do right now.
Yes, Tim? Okay, go ahead. We'll go ahead. Sure.
I'm curious, you both, I'm Carsten Tote from the Environmental Law Institute. You both stress that these responses need to be well thought out and comprehensive. In a situation like Haiti, where you face the prospect of, once again, the emergence of storms, say in the next year, how do you balance the need to respond quickly enough that progress isn't undertaken at a late enough state where you face it just being wiped out in that next season, and then basically facing a Sisyphean task of this same occurrence over and over again? So I guess, how do you balance the need to have a well-orchestrated approach, but also moving quickly enough that you can get something substantive done?
I haven't worked in Haiti, so I'm going to let Kelly respond to that specifically, but I do just want to say that your question applies to so many areas, and in my presentation, I try to talk about that issue. And in our experience, a lot of it has to do with changing mental mindsets. Humanitarian workers that respond to disasters, they have that emergency mindset and that energy and enthusiasm to get things done quickly, and as Kelly pointed out in lots of examples. And in our view, in our experience, yes, in the emergency relief stage, which is usually from 0 to 30 days after an event, of course, the focus has to be on saving human lives, providing shelter, food, water, the basics. But those same people who do that are then often the staff that are involved with developing reconstruction and recovery projects, which take a longer time, but they still have sort of that mental mindset of, even if I'm doing a 5-year project, it's an emergency response. I can't do anything different than what I'm used to doing now. It's going to take longer and cost more, and therefore I can't do it. And our premise has been that it doesn't always take longer and cost more, and sometimes if it does, if that's the right thing to do to reduce risk and vulnerability for the future and improve the outcomes of that project, then maybe that's the better approach to take.
One issue that came up in Haiti, that's come up this time in Haiti with these storms, is there was a lot of flooding damage, a lot of damage to housing caused by flooding. And one of the issues was brought up quite quickly was, if people provide assistance to rebuild, and people rebuild in the same location, then it's just simply continuing the hazardousness of their location. And that was recognized in a general sense, but there's been a great great fighting over this issue about how to move people from where their houses are, because oftentimes they're squatting or they don't have legal title. So it comes back to this land tenure issue, which is, again, a current problem. So in the case of Haiti, until you deal with some of these fundamental problems, you're only going to put Band-Aids or temporarily resolve the damage that you see, the causes of the damage that you see right now. So disaster relief is Band-Aids, and it's fixing the immediate problem so people can survive and get back to a normal. But dealing with that normal is another challenge.
Tim?
Tim Resch with USAID, Bureau for Africa. I wanted to ask about the kind of environmental considerations of disaster preparedness and the false alarms associated with disaster preparedness, whether it's man-made conflict or preparing natural disasters. It's a predictive process. Where is the cyclone going to hit? Where is the drought going to happen? The El Nino. A lot of things are, in fact, recurring or predictive, and whether a dicey political situation degrades into a conflict or not, there are, as part of that disaster preparedness, there's things like prepositioning stocks, pesticides for a locust epidemic that doesn't happen, degradation of spoilage of food stocks or other things, and the cost of false alarms where people become blasé about the 100-year flood that never comes, or will this cyclone or hurricane hit our area or not, and those seem to be not immediate impact questions, but rather things that we can prepare for. So I was wondering how well we are doing as a conservation or a humanitarian community in mitigating environmental impacts associated with disaster preparation.
To It's an interesting question. I guess from my experience, I would have to say not very well. I think in the environmental community, Jeff alluded to, above the fold headline disasters, which do happen. But from our experience and from our analysis, disasters happen every day. And they're not very natural, most of them. Most of them are linked to some pre-existing condition or degradation. And we're finding, my team is finding that working with our conservation community and colleagues, in some cases it's a tough sell to convince even environmentalists that disasters are an issue and they have an impact on conservation and they have an impact on our conservation agenda, and we need to take that on board and incorporate it in our own planning. As environmentalists, we want to think that those things only happen every once in a while and it'll happen to someone else somewhere else, and that has proven not to be the case.
I think there's an increasing recognition in the development and humanitarian community that disasters occur and they need to be addressed as part of development. And Anita highlighted that with some of the quotes from the World Bank. World Bank has a policy to incorporate risk reduction, and in most cases that deals with environmental risk reduction in their development portfolio. There was a study done by Tier Fund on European Union policy in this area, and it found the policies are all right, but the practice isn't. The practice isn't there. And so I think that highlights the issue is that, yes, we talk about stockpiles, we talk about warning systems, but many people will come in and say, yeah, we need a warning system in West Africa, for instance, because the problems there are rain or no rain. I mean, it's kind of a simple environmental problem. Rain, we got a problem, and no rain, we got a problem. And rains too much, we got a problem. It doesn't rain enough, we got a problem. But people think of the warning system as the end point of the intervention. And what we're not looking at is changes in the environment systematically. We're not looking at how humans are impacting the environment. And we're not incorporating that into both the development planning and also the disaster risk reduction, because disaster risk reduction should be part of the development planning. So in Niger, I was involved in a study where we went out and asked people, well, what are you doing about the drought? And they had lots of things they were doing. I mean, they were diversified to the max, except getting insurance from AIG, I guess. But they were doing lots of different things. But the problem was that the developmental approach was very tubular, monolithic. And the people who were having the problem, who were supposed to be helped by the development, were very diversified. So you had this different approach to the problem. And when you come in and talk about, well, what are you going to do about lack of rainfall, they could list all sorts of things they would do about lack of rainfall, but a project would only do one thing, or a project would only do one thing. So there's this difference between the people are responding to it and the institutions are, and the reasons for that. But I think I want to highlight here is the fact that it is the people who respond to these disasters, and they're not incompetent and sit around and wait for somebody to do things. If they did that, they'd be dead. So people are doing a lot of things, and in a lot of the work that we do on disaster risk reduction and environmental issues, we tend to think we can tell them how to deal with these problems, and we don't spend a lot of time, unfortunately, understanding how they deal with the problems and matching our assistance to their needs. So if we did that, I think we would have much more success in dealing with the problems you mentioned.
That's very interesting. Hannah?
Hi, my name's Hannah Fairbank. I'm a biodiversity specialist, with USAID. And I had one response and then a question. I just wanted to respond to my State Department colleague. Oh, he's right here. Okay. Maybe a little circuitously. I'm not that apprised of how environment and conservation issues are either a source or an enhancement of conflict in Afghanistan, but I do know that USAID has some pretty significant investments in the environment sector right now in Afghanistan via a National Environmental Protection Agency development and a regulatory system. So the U.S. government has taken a pretty forward stance in trying to set up some of these institutions and frameworks for improved environmental procedures and that kind of thing. And then we're also doing some more targeted conservation work with the snow leopard and some other issues. I guess my question is to both of the panelists, thank you, particularly to Kelly. You were talking a little bit about how governance systems need to be strong and in place in order to deal with some of the NRM issues. But I guess I kind of wanted to flip that on its head and pose the question, in your experience, have there been areas where looking at the governance of natural resources and the rights to those resources have actually provided a platform for increased stability? I can think of a couple of cases, but I'm just wondering, in all of the work that you've done using, improved natural resource management governance structures, has provided increased stability and opportunities to kind of transition from the relief and response into development in post-conflict situations.
It's a big world. A strange example comes to mind probably for you, but in India they have a very good environmental legislation, environmental review legislation, but they also have a rule that I think all the ocean development, shoreline development has to be 500 meters back from the coast. And it's a progressively implemented thing because you have grandfathered clauses, people who are living on the coast can't be moved back. But it's become recognized as something that reduces cyclone damage. And so over time, as this legislation, as the rules come to be applied, as things get destroyed and are not rebuilt, you have people moving back from the coast. But in certain areas, it's kind of hard because the laws aren't applied equally in all parts of India. So you have a case of Goa, where a lot of the hotels are actually built behind the dunes. Okay, so if they were to have storm surges there, they would be in a better situation. But on the other side of the country, in Orissa, on the other side of the country, Bhubaneswar is the capital of the state, forget the name of the state. But they have an area where they grow shrimp, and it's a very exploitative, where they cut down the mangroves and make shrimp ponds on the coast and everything like that. And so it's an uneven application. I think that's the challenge, is that most disasters occur in places where there isn't a strong rule of law, or when you come in after a conflict, for instance, the rule of law that's being established is an outgrowth of an imposition of outside control on an area. And so saying that there's been a successful example is kind of a challenge at this point, because sometimes by the time, like in Liberia, for instance, it's going to take a long time for them to get to a point where you can say quite confidently that they've dealt with the environmental issues that contributed to the conflict. And I really can't take it beyond that, because that gets really into the developmental long-term kinds of things, which is what the World Bank more deals with than what the disaster response people deal with.
I think just to add on, I think Hannah's point or question brings up a good point in terms of marrying that to your point, Kelly, about people living integrated lives and having integrated and multi-adaptation strategies, yet we have these single sector ones. So the challenge in an AID framework to do natural resource management and count that as investment in public participation around a user group and such, where all these examples of people saying, well, the first time I got to vote for anything was around kind of control of real local natural resource, is this challenge of the way that we structure a lot of our assistance programs just don't allow for taking account of that and seeing that as a win-win or a win-win-win, depending on how many ones you want to add to it. But by counting it just in a single sector, then some of these things, then it's environment as tree hugging and panda hugging rather than environment as livelihoods and anti-poverty and stability and such. And the way we structure our efforts really put us kind of tie one hand behind our back. Other comments, questions, so that I don't sit up here speechifying. Yep, right down here, please.
Mike Colby, also from USAID. I was just reading last night a chapter in Tom Friedman's new book, and he brought up the issue of Katrina as being a game changer in thinking about climate and disasters. And I'm wondering if any of you have seen any change in the way, any lessons from Katrina here in the U.S. in how we approach disaster relief overseas.
World Wildlife Fund was not involved with the Katrina response. Unfortunately, most of our work is international and not domestic. But I'm going to put my colleague John Randall on the spot, who's here, who did some work on Katrina, both before he joined WWF and afterwards, in some collaboration with our climate change program. And John, can I put you on the spot and just talk a little bit about what you did with that project, and to respond to this gentleman's comment?
Okay, I don't know if I have the exact answer to your question. What I was doing after Hurricane Katrina was working with FEMA as an environmental consultant on very local scale environmental work in terms of where they were putting temporary housing and would it impact wetlands and that sort of thing. There has been some research that's come out of Katrina in the journal Science. There was a statistic that it was the single largest forestry disaster on record. From the hurricane that killed so many commercial trees out there. I think in terms of climate change, and is FEMA addressing climate change as an issue now? I think that's more a question for the new administration, and probably not something that had really been on the table before. That's all the answer I really have for you.
Well, not in terms of policy, but just in terms of
the operation of FEMA?
People are thinking, no, in terms of international community.
Actually, initially after Katrina, then if you were an American trying to give advice to other countries, people said, yeah, look what happened to you. But I would say the tsunami has had much greater impact. It's been studied to death. There are huge volumes of studies about what happened after the tsunami, partly because there was a lot of money, and so a lot of things could be done after the tsunami. And so I've been working in the country Tajikistan, which has a very low chance of having a tsunami, not zero, but very low. And they joke, are you going to come and tell us about the tsunami again? So I think, in a sense, some of the lessons about Katrina have been carried on a little bit in the Caribbean and Latin America, where they have the risk of hurricanes and the idea of overtopping and things like that. But the issues of evacuating large cities really hasn't come up in many places that I know of. People haven't really thought through that. As a matter of fact, I got an email a couple of days ago from somebody asking, is there any examples of dealing with disasters in urban areas? And they're relatively few. Humanitarian community tends to stay out of urban areas. They're too difficult to work with. So I think some of the lessons from Katrina about evacuation, about the dangerousness of a place and everything like that haven't necessarily been translated into the humanitarian community very well.
But I would just add to that, too, that I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not an expert on climate or climate change. But if you read any of the reports that come out, I mean, it's hair-raising. And for me, what is most frightening about climate change is not the Katrina-like storms that we may or may not be seeing as a result of climate change. It's all the things that's happening under the radar, that's happening every day, impacting ecosystems around the world.
Well, to me, that's the thing. No one's talking about protection of the wetlands or the mangrove systems that protect the shoreline and people living behind it. I would expect that.
Yeah, I think this is in part one of the big challenges that we have. It's clear that climate change is going to be the point of entry on a lot of discussions in this country and the international scene with the Copenhagen 2009 conference coming up. And a lot of people are coming to it, and there's greater attention. We'll see if there are greater resources. And I think part of it is finding ways to integrate those newly interested with coming from different angles in ways that are constructive, that do kind of get beyond loving the headlines down to what it really means and the opportunities as well as the threats that come with it. I would add, again, from the perspective of the Environmental Change and Security Program, one of the impacts of Katrina was reawakening or putting these issues back on the larger foreign and security policy agenda of the country. So you have what is essentially a Katrina paragraph in the National Security Strategy, which allows any part of government to then act in this area, essentially being overwhelmed by Katrina and seeing that the that even the kind of all of the government, once finally applied, had difficulty dealing with that one situation, was a wake-up call, so that you're now seeing ripple effects, again, through the lens of climate change, but then taking in multiple manifestations in different parts of government, including the traditional foreign and security policy community, coming back to that where greater attention was being paid in the 90s, although then not through climate change. Is there Alice? Oh, do you want to go ahead? Yeah, and then we'll have Alice.
Oh, go ahead, and then I'll just add my piece.
I'm Alice Day. I'm a sociologist and a recent filmmaker. The film is about the environmental impact of war, and one of the segments in the film is about Afghanistan. And there was a particularly interesting part of it. The piece we have was made by a person from the UN Environmental Program, David Jensen. And he was saying that the UN doesn't go in unless local people invite them to come. And then he made a very strong statement that the way to get restoration in these countries is to go to the people and find out what they think is important and what they need to have done. But he said they wanted to do some training of people in environmental issues, but they couldn't find older people to fill those roles, so they were turning to younger people. And I wonder if this is sort of a wave of the future in some of these countries, that it's the younger people who are going to need to be trained and brought into the whole system of restoring their country and looking ahead for it. If you could if this is a sort of general thing that's going to be happening.
Well, as I discussed in my presentation, part of what we try to do is encourage humanitarian agencies to think beyond material goods and infrastructure, but think about building back human capacity to manage natural resources, and to do that in a way that's also multi-sectoral, so not just building back the capacity of government environment or fisheries management officers, but also local communities and youth programs. And we have a few examples I'd be happy to discuss with you afterwards about where we have been able to involve children, young people. There's an example that we have from work in Thailand where WWF and the Red Cross collaborated on what they call garbage banks, where they work with school children to collect garbage, recycle it, and they get a little of financial feedback as a result of that. It's learning them, teaching them how to manage waste and recycle, but it's also teaching them how to manage finances. And there's other examples from Indonesia and Sri Lanka as well. But I agree with you completely. There does need to be attention paid to young people, and that's why I mentioned in my presentation that we like to use interns in our program. We really want to be involved with academic institutions and programs like this that are asking these kinds of questions and encouraging young people as they develop their education and their professional capacity to think about breaking down those sectoral silos and thinking about the world in a more integrated approach so that they are available in the case of the Afghanistan project that you described to build back capacity in their own countries in this way.
From the disaster risk reduction perspective, I know some programs where they've done a lot of training of young people, and then they all go someplace else. So one of the challenges of training people, particularly in countries where they're difficultly supporting themselves from agriculture or whatever livelihoods they have, is that they migrate out. And so that's been a big problem, training people. In one country I know they train rescue teams, for instance, and teams to deal with early warning and other issues, and then the teams dissipate because people leave the country looking for other things.
Yeah, please.
I just want to come back to the climate change thing, and I hate to do this in a public forum like this, but I was at a presentation by one of the researchers from the University of Colorado who deals with climate change, and he made a very important point, is that the correlation between population growth in the coast of the United States and disaster impact is very clear. The correlation between climate change and disaster impact is not. So I think we need to be careful a bit about understanding that people live in hazardous locations. They live in New Orleans, live in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, and it's historically been the case, and probably will continue to be the case, is where people live defines how they're going to be affected by these events. So for me, disasters are a business opportunity. Climate change is making more disasters will be more opportunity. So I look at it as a growth industry. But we also need to keep in mind that if people move away from places that are hazardous, or they live in places that are hazardous in a less hazardous fashion, then changes in the climate, whatever they are going to have less of an impact. So to de-emphasize, I'd rather de-emphasize the climate change aspect and emphasize the hazardousness aspect in this.
Okay. Link, did you have a question?
I'm Lincoln Day. I'm also a sociologist and demographer, and also recently a filmmaker. Part of what I was going to ask about has already been answered by Mr. Kelly, but it seems to me, first of all, that you shouldn't worry too much about people having too much education, that basic literacy isn't going to increase very many jobs for these people in other places, and I think that's the most important thing to get. Kerala, state of Kerala in India, puts its educational emphasis not on training people to be doctors and lawyers and engineers and so on, but on training them simply to the level of basic literacy. And I think they've been quite successful with that in the past. But I wondered about something that both of you have alluded to, and that is creating environment or institutional conditions that are going to help avoid the worst aspects of disasters, and perhaps also lessen the likelihood of man-made disasters. And I was thinking, for instance, institutions, good, efficient marketing systems for distribution of food, voting systems make possible more readily, more available at any rate, the more equal distribution of wealth, material wealth in these countries. Certainly literacy for women has been very important about population control, but no one's mentioned anything much about population, though I should have thought, along with food, clothing, shelter, and fresh water, that birth control would be one of the most important things that these people would need, and very often we find want. In fact, to go back to an example here in the Great Society period of President Johnson, this was the first program that anybody knew of that had actually asked poor people what they wanted, rather than telling them what they should have. And two things turned up in that none of the geniuses who planned these programs had thought of. One was they wanted birth control. The other was they wanted divorces.
Yes, I will tackle that one, and I'll also put another colleague on the spot and call on my boss, who's sitting in the back, Judy Oglethorpe, who runs a program in WWF that deals with exactly what you're discussing, population, gender, and the environment. And maybe I could put Judy on the spot and ask her to say a few comments about that.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with you completely that population is a huge issue, and as populations continue to grow in many developing countries, we have more and more people living in more and more vulnerable places, as people have to occupy more marginal lands on coastlines, in dry areas, and areas prone to flooding and so on. So, huge links, I think, with population growth and number of people who are vulnerable. I actually just, if I can add a comment that I had stuck my hand up earlier, but sitting in the back has its disadvantages. I just wanted to add also to this, commenting on Kelly's remark that it really matters where people live. Climate change will happen, but the biggest impacts on people are going to be where they live. I think there's more to it than that, though, because not only is climate going to affect people, and the size of the population is going to affect how severely they're affected, but it's also going to be affecting biodiversity at the same time. And we know that biodiversity has been affected by big changes in the past, and it's we've had a lot of adaptations in the past, but this is going to happen really quickly. And for biodiversity and natural systems to be able to adapt, we need to actually be taking as much pressure off the natural systems as we can. We need to be maintaining sort of connectivity along altitudinal gradients, latitudinal gradients, and so on, so that species, animal and plant species, can move according to these changing climate pressures. And if we have habitats that are all fragmented, people living in the way, overexploitation, it's going to be much more difficult for biodiversity to adapt. Yet we're all totally dependent on these natural systems and natural species for our lives, water, resources, and so on. So the best thing that we can do is to take the pressure off biodiversity in order for it to adapt better. But climate's going to be affecting people at the same time. People are going to be probably using the environment in different ways because of climate change. So crops are going to fail, there'll be flooding, there'll be drought, and so on. There'll be health problems. There'll be a lot of people on the move. Where are those people going to move to? You know, they may try and go to coastlines, but coastlines, sea level's going to be rising. Maybe they're going to be moving into protected areas. Where are those empty spaces? There aren't that many empty spaces left. So we need to find win-win solutions where we can take the pressure off biodiversity, but also help people to reduce their vulnerability and enable them to adapt. So we have, for example, a few cases in Fiji where we worked with local communities to build their resilience and also to build the resilience of biodiversity. So we helped to restore the coastal vegetation, the mangroves. We helped them to protect the reef, take the pressure off the reef so that the reef could recover. And this would help to prevent storm surges, which was starting to flood their houses. We also worked with them to, one of their other problems was that wells were becoming more saline with sea level rise. So we worked with them to catch rainwater and things, various other examples like this. But we really, you know, I think climate change is going to bring a lot more disasters. There are things that we can do at local level, at national level, but we need to think not only about people, but also about how can we help biodiversity to adapt. Because if we don't do both together and try and find solutions that work for both, we're going to have even bigger problems. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Judy. And I should say that WWF has a new manual on these PHE, Pop Health and Environment programs. So folks who are interested in learning more in a very practical way about doing it should take a look at what Judy and colleagues are doing, as well as hopefully some of the resources, given that that's another big focus of our program here. Some of the resources we have on the website will hopefully be of use as well. Yeah, Kelly?
I just want to bring up something because the comment about Hurricane Katrina raised an interesting point. What we found in Hurricane Katrina, as a matter of fact, was communities that were organized and self-activating were able to tackle and present themselves and address environmental issues better than the communities that weren't, of course. But you had a case where the populations were dispersed and everything, and although the state government followed their normal procedures for environmental review, they couldn't do any consultations because the people were in Houston and Washington and all these other places. But there was one community that stayed together. It was the Chef Mantour waste dump, and I forget the name of the parish or the town, part of New Orleans. And the idea, the state wanted to move garbage, refuge into this one site called Chef Mantour, and the community said, no, we don't want any of this, and they fought back fairly successfully, I think, and got a coalition of organizations to support them. And I think that highlights one of the points about whether you talk about climate change or disaster risk reduction or addressing environmental issues, is that if communities themselves can start defining what they want and what they don't want, and start saying we need this and we need that and we need to take these actions, that's really going to where change takes place. The governmental regulations, as in the case I was citing in India, are all there, but it's until the communities start taking charge and enforcing those and getting control of the resources, or at least nominal control of the resources, that you're going to start seeing some changes in both reduction of disaster risk and also improvement in environmental conditions.
I think we've had a very rich discussion. I really appreciate these presentations. They're both informed by a large set of cases and kind of analysis across cases, but really embedded and built on very specific instances and examples of experiences that you all have had and your colleagues have had. So those are in many ways the very best kinds of presentations. So I appreciate that very much. As I mentioned, we will, as we do with all our meetings, try to continue to be a resource for you to share these presentations, insights, and the discussion from this with colleagues, because, of course, that's part of the point for us to speak to and be useful to people that are outside the room as well as those here. You can do that on the Wilson Center website, the Environmental Change and Security Program website, as well as our blog, the New Security Beat, and so you'll find these discussions in multiple multimedia formats there. As I said, again, thanks to AID and the multiple offices there, including Tim's. I should have mentioned Tim's, the Africa Bureau folks as well, supporting this effort to try to bring these things together. I think, for me, one of the big messages of all these meetings has been really we have integrated challenges, we have integrated responses, and we so often just do our stovepiped attempts to try to deal with them. And so overcoming that, it's great to have kind of more fodder for that discussion. So please join me in thanking our guests and our presenters for what's excellent session.